I'd had 3 sets of parents and a deep wound that just said, I must not have been good enough or smart enough or pretty enough or enough for these parents where they had to give me up.
Pay attention, because there was another lesson to learn, and until we actually understand it to the core, it actually doesn't escape us.
I thought that I was, rather invincible. Like, I felt like I kept screwing up life, but I didn't think I would die.
It's actually happening through us, and it is for a reason. And that's the very point that you've actually just said. Where is this actually coming up in my life that I'm needing to experience it?
If the answer is no, then it's very clear to be able to go somewhere where you do feel like you're listened to, number one, and number two, that you're supported and strengthened.
And that's so important, to actually ensure that who we actually have surrounding us is actually in alignment with the person that we're actually continuously choosing to become.
This is Let's Pay Attention, Hacking Consciousness. I'm Cathy Dimarchos. Let's explore what it means to lead, live, and listen with intention.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Pay Attention, Hacking Consciousness. I have actually got the privilege of introducing you to our next guest, and she is absolutely extraordinary. And you will actually be able to feel her through every word that she actually shares. And it is such a privilege to actually have her on this podcast with us. Before I actually start, let me give you a really brief introduction, because the depth of who Bridget actually is, I can't even begin to actually bring into this actual session with you. But let me give you a summary. Bridget Cook-Burch is traditionally actually known as a book whisperer. She is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author. She's a publisher, a mentor, a humanitarian, and an actual speaker who is actually known for riveting stories of transformation. Her powerful work has actually been showcased on Oprah, Dateline, Netflix, Discovery Plus, A&E, CNN, GMA, NPR, and in People, amongst many others. Bridget's own intense NDE changed her life, and her story and what she was actually telling herself, this set her on a path to actually discover other extraordinary stories. And it is the core of who she is and what she actually does. She's the CEO and founder of Your Inspired Story. Bridget offers safe space and a deep experiential learning through group coaching, executive coaching, hosting inspired writers' retreats, and more. And her greatest passion is actually helping you to actually discover the importance of your actual story and to become the leader that's actually in your community and in the world as a whole. So please actually welcome Bridget and embrace her like everybody else who actually knows her into your life. You're going to love her.
Wow, what do I do after that, Cathy? That's quite the introduction. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Bridget, I don't know how to actually introduce you, because you just are such a beautiful soul. And I know that every single person who actually meets you experiences that from you.
Thank you. Not everybody. I'm not everyone's cup of tea, but I love it when I am. And I love it when I can get to know other individuals. It's just a beautiful life, that's for sure.
Well, welcome to the show. I don't know where this conversation is going to go. I'm ready to explore, where it actually takes us. But one of the things that you and I both, I guess, are very focused on is the level of consciousness and, paying attention to what our surroundings are and what actually happens for us, personally. And so I want to explore that, in this discussion. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. Let's dive in.
Do you mind maybe if we actually share a little bit about your story, and if I can get you to introduce yourself in a different way to what I shared with the audience?
Certainly, certainly. Well, it's interesting because my near-death experience would not be complete if I didn't tell you who I was before it, which I had been adopted at 6 months. So already by that time, I'd had 3 sets of parents and a deep wound that just said, I must not have been good enough or smart enough or pretty enough or enough for these parents, where they had to give me up. And I had really amazing adoptive parents, but it was still this deep, unconscious psychological wound that I came from. And because of that, I was always trying to prove myself worthy of friendship, prove myself worthy of love, prove myself worthy of my parents' respect, whatever I could do. But there was also like this other part of me that wanted to explore the world and, do amazing things. And sometimes they were at cross points with one another. The striving to prove myself really got me into a lot of trouble when I was in my early 20s. I was going to college at the university and I was working 3 jobs because it was a smaller university and the jobs were pretty scarce. So I was doing what I could to bring in any income and, going to school full time. And I got to the point where I was failing everything. I was just spread so thin. And I didn't dare ask for help because in my own view of the world at the time, it was only a matter of time before the big people would leave. And so I was fiercely independent and I just never asked for help. But one day I had been so sick. I thought I had the flu, but I lost 30 pounds in 3 days. I was completely emaciated. I couldn't keep anything down. And I just needed my mommy. So I drive down this really steep canyon, just shaking. I shouldn't have been driving at all. But I just had the one direct to get to my mother's house and then it would all be okay. So I drove up, but when I pulled into the driveway, the only thing, Cathy, that I could think of is, this is the woman that I want to impress the most. And I've screwed it all up. And I didn't have much energy, but also psychologically and in my heart, I just felt like I've got to go knock on the door and ask for help. And all I wanted to be for her was someone that she could be proud of. And here I was in this puddle. And so I dragged myself to the door and, part of the reason we weren't getting along was because at one point I thought about becoming a nun, but it didn't feel like the right path for me. But I was a major partier. I wanted to belong. So I would hang out in these crowds and, not doing well in school for the first time in a long time. And so I came up to her door and she took one look at me. And luckily she sensed right away. She said, I've got to get you to the doctor. So I didn't even walk inside. She put me into her car, took me to the doctor's office. And luckily, I'm glad that she had, because I collapsed there. And it was right next to the hospital. They took me into emergency surgery and they pumped out pints and pints of sepsis, of infection. And I had fissures and ulcers in my colon and some other things that were happening in that area. And it was all inflamed and horrifically infected. So they put me on 6 or 7 different kinds of intravenous antibiotics. And they would all be on this pole together. And it was infusing in my system, but I couldn't have it in a regular vein. They had to put it in what's called a subclavian because I was so emaciated. So they put that in. They took me out of surgery, put me in a room, and expected that I would be getting better because they found the infection and I had all these antibiotics. But Cathy, what no one knew was that I was allergic to one of them. I'd never had it before. There was no reason anyone could know. And what we didn't know is that it was killing me. So instead of getting better, I was spiking these huge high fevers, 106, 107. They were getting worried about brain damage. There was all of these things. My mother stayed and stayed and stayed. And finally, she went home a couple days into this to get some rest. And about 2:00 in the morning outside in the corridor, I heard my 2 nurses talking to each other. And they said, you know what, I think we better call her mom back because she's not going to make it until morning. And I don't know about you, but earlier in my 20s, I thought that I was rather invincible. Like I felt like I kept screwing up life, but I didn't think I would die. And now all of a sudden I was dying, Cathy. And the one thing I can tell you is that I knew I had not fulfilled the measure of my creation. And I didn't even know what that was. I had no clue what my purpose was on the planet. I just knew I had come to do something and hadn't done it. And so I was so sad. And all I could think of is, I'm going to die. And it was all for nothing. And then I had this extraordinary experience where this two beautiful presences came into my room, but one was just right here, so present. The other one was kind of in the corner, and he shined too. But this one, oh, Cathy, he just shined with so much unconditional love. And I could recognize the face of my creator right in front of me. Like I knew him. I knew him with everything that I was. And he loved me. He didn't care what lousy grades I was getting, what fool I had made of myself in the last weekend. Didn't care, where my grades were at, how much debt I was in. He just loved me for me. And his love in this room was so powerful that it changed everything. I could see it changing the cells of my body. Like everything was vibrating with his love. And I knew that also he was healing me. And for the very first time, I fell asleep, but not before he told me, he said, I'm giving you a second chance at life. And so I fell asleep with this knowing that I was being given a second chance. And I woke up the next morning after sleeping, really sleeping for the first time in days. And they're wheeling in more intravenous antibiotics, and the nurses putting them, all in, hooking them up. And I said, look, I can have all of these, but I can't have this one. And she goes, what are you talking about? We thought we were going to lose you last night. These are the only things saving your life. And I said, not this one. It's killing me. And so she thinks I'm, fruit fly. So she goes off to talk to the doctor. And fortunately for me, he'd had other patients with near-death experiences, and he listened to me. He took me seriously, and he took me off that antibiotic. Kept the other ones on, but took me off that one. And in the next 24 hours, I walked out of that hospital on my own power. And so, Cathy, the person that I was before that experience and the person that I was after that experience was completely different. I was still my very human, fallible self. And all my, my family, my friends and siblings will tell you, like, they didn't notice probably much, but I started telling myself a different story. Like I was loved, and every single person on the planet I knew had access to the same deep level of adoration and love. And it changed me. When I went out into the world, I was no longer afraid of people. I wanted to love them. I wanted to get to know them. I wanted to know their stories. And as they would tell them to me, I could see the threads of their stories and of their own beliefs and where it had led them and led them and led them. And then also where they could go if they wanted to. And it just fell in love with the human soul. It was amazing.
Do you know, as I was listening to you, and you would have actually seen me, but the goosebumps, just as you were sharing a lot of what you had experienced was actually coming through, through me. And, do you remember when I introduced you, one of the things that I was saying is that I actually just feel your soul. And that's what people feel. And as I was listening to you, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this makes sense now. This makes sense. Like, you are pure love. Like, from the second that I actually met you, a few years ago, that's what you radiated. And every time I actually see you, that's what you radiate. And the penny just dropped for me now. And, you've shared some of this with me, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you. That's the highest compliment that you could give me, because that was the highest example I've ever been shown of just the power of unconditional love. It's amazing. So thank you. That is a great compliment.
Thank you. Gosh, I love you. Seriously.
I love you too.
You know, I think what you actually shared just in respect to you actually having that inner strength and inner knowing to be able to voice something with so much conviction, especially, you know, in that realm of, you know, hospitals, doctors, is so, I think, important for people to actually recognize that we do have an inner knowing, and sometimes we might actually be in an environment where there is somebody who is a lot more learned than what we are in that field. But what you've highlighted is that we are perhaps sometimes the teacher as well as the student, and the doctor actually, you know, was prepared to listen in that situation, but more so that you had the courage to actually voice it irrespective of you not actually being, you know, the expert. And that's so important in life, particularly in what we're experiencing around the world today.
Yes. In fact, the way my parents taught me is, you know, doctors in Western medicine were next to God. And you listened unequivocally to whatever your doctor said. And there was no room for questioning. So for me to stand up so, you know, so boldly and to say no that was a big, big deal. It was a huge risk for me, but it paid off because I'm still here.
Yeah, there's such a big learning in that, you know, for anybody who's actually listening on both sides. Bridget, I guess that also then leads me into the question of how do we actually then give ourselves permission to have that sort of difficult conversation? Because a lot of people don't have the courage, despite actually having that inner knowing or that intuition or, you know, experience of, you know, having that voice shared with them. How do we actually navigate through that?
Yeah, you know, it's something that I still face, just like every human. You know, we go through life, we go through periods of ups and downs in our health. And, you know, we'll go to experts, sometimes maybe Eastern medicine, sometimes Western medicine. And I have discovered that there is an alignment for me when something really holds true, then I listen, but I can feel it in my whole body. And if I don't feel it in my whole body, if I get uncomfortable, I have to say, you know, I think I'm going to get a second opinion. And, you know, sometimes that really ticks people off. And they're like, but you don't understand. You have to do this thing. But I have learned to take my time, that time between stimulus and response, and to not make decisions. I have a few things coming up over the next few months, and I'm giving myself permission to take it slow and to go and get other points of view, and then to continue every day to listen to my body. So I think, you know, when someone is facing something, first is to recognize that fear is natural. It's our body, it's our breath, it's our life. Yeah. And so when the fear comes up, to not negate it, but to allow it, to feel it, and then to pass through, and then to go deeper into our own sense of self. And a lot of times that requires some quiet. It requires, you know, it doesn't mean you have to be hours in a meditation, but to just, you know, become grounded and aligned with who we are and what our purpose is. And then, you know, ask the body certain questions, because our bodies are so intelligent. I had no idea, but I'm learning just how intelligent our bodies are, and they will tell us yes and no. And sometimes there's you know, well, and then, you know, go get another opinion or take a little bit more time. So I think anything that negates the fear, and you're well aware of this because you help people to navigate fear so well, and then to look at the solutions on the other side, because the fear usually comes for a reason.
Yeah.
And then the solutions come for a big reason. So
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you know, as humans, that's what our actual nervous system has actually been created for, to allow us to actually experience the emotion, you know, that's actually happening for us. And often we actually think that the brain is actually telling the body, but it actually works the other way around. And so it's interesting that I guess what you're actually highlighting is that it is not uncommon for us to have that actual emotion. But what then happens is we bring logic into it that actually prevents us from genuinely taking the time to sit down and pause and really actually experience and allow yourself to consider, why is it that I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing, as opposed to defaulting to the logic that we can apply to it, which may actually take us off track, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that moment to pause is so important. And I think that's what you've also actually, shared with your experiences, taking the time out often to actually sit in that moment of silence is in fact the faster thing to get us there, but we don't do it.
No, but we're always looking for solutions outside of ourselves. I think that is a natural human thing. And as you know, the wiser we choose to become, the more we look for answers from inside rather than from the outside. And then sometimes they work together really nicely.
Yeah, which also then actually comes back to another thing that you talked about, which is that alignment. And that's so important to actually ensure that who we actually have surrounding us is actually in alignment, with the person that we're actually continuously choosing to become, right? Because it's a journey. None of us actually get there. And so ensuring that who it is that's actually surrounding us or, enveloping us is in alignment to ensure that that mirroring that happens, is about strengthening us rather than actually distracting us. What do you think about that?
I love those words that you just spoke. They're actually supporting and strengthening us. So I think that's actually a really good question to ask. Am I feeling supported and strengthened by either a medical team or, a clinic or a doctor or whatever it might be? And if the answer is no, then it's very clear to be able to go somewhere where you do feel like you're listened to, number one, and number two, that you're supported and strengthened. Unfortunately, as you know, in our medical world today, there's a lot of let's take care of the symptoms.
Yeah.
Instead of let's get to the grassroots of what the problem is. And let's see what we can do to cure the root of the cause so that we can take care of the symptoms, but in a systemic way. And there's more and more abilities for us to do that as humans. Science has become, you and I like to nerd out, but science has become so extraordinary. Like, I'm delighted that science for women and medical information for women is becoming more and more a priority, because for a long time it was like, we're just going to lump people together, but we're primarily going to test all the men. And women and men, our bodies function differently. So I really love that there's more and more to support us. And also, I think it's really important that we be our own advocates. Yeah. And I didn't know how to be my own advocate, not in boundaries, not in anything in my life before that experience. But I learned very quickly, like, I know this, and therefore I will speak this, and therefore I will have this boundary, like Dumbledore, you shall not pass.
Yes.
First time I'd ever done anything like that. But we need to be our own advocates because no one knows us the way that we know. And I think too, as mothers and grandmothers, is that if we allow our intuition to be strong, there are times that we may know our children or our grandchildren much better than the doctor. And sometimes it's important for us to be able to show up for our children in an extraordinary way.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're having a pretty frank conversation here, but allowing ourselves to even have these types of conversations is so important, because we don't. And that fear around actually being considered as, I'm going to use a very loose word, but, alternative. I really don't like the word woo-woo. I think it doesn't actually express anything, but being able to be open to what else, what else is actually possible that maybe hasn't actually been explored or maybe hasn't been discussed, but you are experiencing is so important. And so you're so right about that, not just for women, but even for young people, you know, who I'm going to say are leaning more into understanding the feminine side, irrespective of what gender you actually are, is so important. When you were talking earlier, I was actually thinking about, you know, an experience when I was younger. I used to have dreams, Bridget, and, you know, 7 days later, that dream would actually come to fruition. And, you know, it could be anything. It could be anything from a car accident to, like, literally anything. And I actually had one of those experiences whilst I was in Tanzania last week. I woke up in the middle of the night and I had to make a phone call, and it's interesting, but 1 week later, that very thing has actually unfolded. And so us actually bringing to light the reality of who we are as people and what we are capable of and the power that actually sits within us is so important. And, you know, for anybody who's actually listening to that today, your story, I think, actually gives that sort of insight and power, but it's also in business as well. And I know for you know, you work with people from all over the world in all sorts of industries. How do you actually approach those conversations with them? The ones where we are genuinely talking about, well, what is your gut actually telling you?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you brought that up and that we could be that specific, because oftentimes when someone is writing their story, and fiction is a little different, although we still pour ourselves into our characters in fiction. But in nonfiction, you know, memoir or a self-help, a thought leadership book, an autobiography, we're pouring ourselves onto the page, and it's the most vulnerable art form there is, because people get to know our inner thoughts and our motivations, our greatest desires, our greatest failures. If we're writing really powerfully, all of those things will end up on the page. And then we get nervous, sometimes imposter syndrome, like, who am I to write this? Who might I hurt with this? And also, you know, is anybody even going to want to read this? So I often end up having these conversations with people because as we allow ourselves to express creatively our deepest thoughts and emotions and fears and triumphs, sometimes people will forget how they rose out of a situation, and that's important too.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating because it's not only deeply vulnerable, it's deeply telling.
Yeah.
And we'll see our patterns for what they are. And then there comes this time, this level of choice where we can listen to what the world says about it, you know, like about the visibility or what your story should be. Or, you know, it's almost like the world is trying to orchestrate being your director of your life. But there comes a time when most authors who are doing a diligent job, they find a deepening of their story and their book, and they realize there is more power here than I have ever given myself credit for. And so if they allow the deeper conversations with me, you know, anything, any feeling, any emotion, any of the blocks that come up, they're there for a purpose and they have information. And if we can allow ourselves again to be quiet, to take that moment, to allow for the deepening, the books become something extraordinary. You know, something that can touch someone halfway around the world and 50 years from now still have power in the story. Those are my very most favorite. So those are the questions that will come up for an author who truly wants to make an impact. And they're some of the hardest and some of the most delicious conversations I ever have the privilege of having.
I can only begin to imagine the space that you actually hold in those situations. It's not comfortable. You know, it's not comfortable for people to be that vulnerable. And yet you have just actually highlighted the power that those moments actually hold. It's, as you were talking, I was actually thinking about somebody who has just recently actually taken several years away from a public life that they've had to actually go through that journey, and they've just actually shared a snippet of that. And I thought, isn't it wonderful, especially for people who actually have, I guess, built an entire life and career on, I'm going to say, a persona, or an avatar, to actually be able to come to that place and sit with you to then allow that to be seen. And I suspect it's a layer after a layer after a layer.
I was going to say two of those. Yep. And what's amazing too is that every time I'm tackling this with one of my authors, it's interesting because I always say, if I ever hold a judgment, God will bring me a story. And so even as I'm working with them, I know that we're often mirrors for each other. So I'm like, where is this also residing in me? This resistance or this worry or this fear or this vulnerability and the fear of being visible. And so anyway, it's all delicious. That's for sure. Even the hardest stuff. And sometimes the hardest stuff is where the greatest glory lies. Because, I had a coach once. He was a coach before coaching was cool. Tells you how old I am. And he said, in our darkness lies the seeds of our greatest glory. And I remember being young enough when I was working with him and I'm like, okay. And now I'm like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's so much truth in that. There is so much truth in that.
I think one of the things that has actually, on that point that we often hear is, how come this is happening to me?
Mm-hmm.
But what you've highlighted, and something that, I guess I've begun to learn or better understand is it's actually happening through us. And it is for a reason. And that's the very point that you've actually just said. Where is this actually coming up in my life that I'm needing to experience it? And so having that mirror actually, be there in that moment is actually a gift. And we don't often see it as a gift. We actually see it as an obstacle, or a challenge or, confronting, and so we avoid it. Can I actually get you to maybe actually share your thoughts around that, in how often that actually comes up in life and the opportunity that we have to pay attention to have a different lens around that?
I love that because you're all about paying attention. And I would also say, resistance is the most difficult thing we will ever face here on the planet. It's greater than loss. It's greater than death, just because it is a power and a force that can either mold us and shape us, or it can keep us contained, in a cage, in a coffin long before it's our time. And I think it's important when it comes up for us to take the time to take a look at, where is this coming from and what is this about? There's an author that I absolutely love, and he's a screenwriter too. His name is Stephen Pressfield, and he wrote an extraordinary book called The War of Art. Not the art of war, the war of art. He turned it on its head. But he talks about how if you're going to do any great endeavor, you're going to create something. There will always be resistance. And so when you learn to accept it and when you learn to learn from it, then it becomes your ally. You always have to be aware that it's going to be there in its different forms. And our ego, as you know, because you're always about hacking consciousness. So, the ego will just play a different game sometimes, like, oh yeah, I've got this handled now. Yep. Not. And then we learn another lesson, right? And we get to go to a deeper level or a broader level. And one thing I will tell you, because I love what you said about, this shift from this keeps happening to me. And I will tell you that on the hero's journey, everyone begins as a victim of beliefs, a victim of circumstances, a victim of other people's agendas, whatever it might be, or we think we are, which turns out to be a lie, but it creates these conflicts along the way as we're making our way along our journey. It's so fascinating that we have these thresholds over and over and over that we can cross, that there's the death of the old self and there is the newness of the new, more committed self that we find along this journey. And there's such glorious gifts at the end. You know, we all end up with this beautiful elixir of life. It's the wisdom we've learned. It's the soul sculpting that has happened. And we go from being a victim of our life to being a victor of our life. And we see, oh, what happened to me is actually for me. And then I love how you said that it happens through us, because I feel like that's another level of consciousness when we go, okay, if everything is happening for me, then what can I take out into the world to co-create through me? And this is where I think that greater level of consciousness abides, where, if I may be so bold as to say, when you are in co-creation with all of creation, the things are happening through you, you will see more places you can serve. You will see more hearts that you can touch. You will see more love in your life than you can ever imagine. And I know you've experienced this. And you will see more miracles that take place that should not happen. And yet they keep happening over and over because you choose to be a vessel of it. So I'm so delighted that you see that and understand that. I think that's something we've known about each other for a long time.
Yeah. It's such a privilege to actually be able to sit in that space. And, you know, I can tell you that there are many situations where, you know, I've gone, oh, I've got that. And boy, am I knocked off that perch, because I go, oh no, I don't, because I've got to learn it again. I've actually missed something, right? It's really fascinating. There's one particular, I'm going to say, experience in life where I can actually reflect back and go, there are 3 times I have had to learn and relearn and unlearn and relearn that lesson. And I was sure I had it the last time. And yet here I am again. And I think, but with each time, there's actually been a really different depth to the learning. And I think that's, for me, I guess, the gift that I afford myself, which is that pay attention, because there was another lesson to learn. And until we actually understand it to the core, it actually doesn't escape us. And I love that you actually used the word the coffin, because it does actually keep us entrapped, you know, until we genuinely allow it to pass through us to actually reach that level of depth of awareness. And so sometimes we fear that, no, you know, and we push it away without allowing ourselves to go to that depth. And so where you actually, I'm going to say, allow people to come to that place of realization is extraordinary, because not everybody can actually do what you do.
Thank you. And I do my best. I'm very human, but I have found so many gifts and miracles in holding that space and allowing them to walk through it, that, you know, then I watch like the shackles and the chains and the coffin lids come off. It's beautiful to behold. It really is. And I also think, Cathy, you know, I think that we have created a lot of patterns for ourselves so that we can learn deeper. And I also feel like, you know, because the ego can think that they're queen or king. If you let it, if you allow it, if I allow it, every time I have one of those experiences, there is more humility, more humbleness. It's like, oh, I don't have everything that I think I have. Let's go on another adventure, you know, and then our heart breaks wide open, and we know we don't have all the answers. And so then, you know, it's that thing of, I'm going to look inside myself, where sometimes I turn away, but I'm also going to, you know, be open to answers that I've not seen before. And if we think we know it all, we think we got it down, if that's old hat, then, you know, we stop growing. But the minute we are like, okay, that was painful, and what do I have to learn from this? It's like, you know, the Care Bear stare, like our hearts, they just break wide open. And then there's experiences and people and situations and circumstances that are attracted to us because we have just moved into a whole new level and layer. And I love to see that too. It's painful sometimes, as you know, but it's also rich with meaning. So,
Do you know, you said earlier, something that I think is really powerful, and sometimes we can't have the conversations with people or express it in words, but what you do is actually allow people to put something on a page, and that actually radiates out into the world in ways that sometimes we have no idea about. And I think that actually gives us so much power. And so, for anybody who's actually thinking about, writing, whether it be a poem or writing a book, I think that's something that we don't necessarily think of. And the default is, who am I to? And I've heard you actually share this, phrase or statement or insight, and that is, who are you not to? And I want to actually explore that with you, because I think you can talk to it in a way where people may actually be able to look within themselves and reframe that story and that narrative that they perhaps have been saying to themselves for a long time to come to a different place. Do you mind if I actually ask you to talk to that point?
yes. And I will share with you a great lesson that I learned about that had to do with a woman's story. And I just got to walk beside her as she was going through some of it, but she taught me so amazingly. So this is Rebecca Musser, and it's in our New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling book called The Witness Wore Red. And this woman was the 19th wife of 65 women. And she was, in a church that was becoming very quickly a cult under this particular leader, Warren Jeffs. And all she knew was that everything that she had been raised to believe felt like it was crumbling. And, she'd been raised, just keep sweet, pray and obey, and everything will be okay. And it doesn't matter how much you suffer here in this lifetime, you'll get to be with God in heaven. And there were other things that were more twisted about those belief systems, but it's all she knew. And then she ended up escaping when her husband died. She had been forced to marry a man more than 4 times her age. He was older than her grandfather, and he was the prophet of the church. And when he died is when Warren Jeffs took over his son. And he was a pedophile and used it in, his status as a prophet. And so she escaped past the security guards and the gates and all of these things. And she ran away from this community, 10,000 people that were her lifeblood, that she really adored. And it was difficult for her, but she started to live a life outside of this psychological mind twist of a community that it had become, and she became free of so much of that. But there came a time when she needed to testify against this pedophile prophet. And it was a really difficult thing. And one day, here she has to have more security guards, and they were for her protection this time, because her life was being threatened and she was going to go testify. And she's out on this property of land, and she just can't take it any longer. She couldn't be with her children. She'd made their costumes for Halloween, and people were cruel to her. And she went out into the desert in Texas and just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And all she could think of is, why me? Like that victim mentality, right? But it was so real and clear and plain to her. Why me? Why out of 10,000 people do I have to be the one to testify? Like, why couldn't it be someone else? Why me? And she's laying on this rock, this slab, and the hot Texas sun begins to rise. And it's, it's in the desert, it's kind of like this sizzling heat as it began to rise. And she began to feel like her very cells on fire. And then she heard this voice that said, don't ask why me, ask show me. And she got a little, sassy in that moment. Like, okay, then show me. And all of a sudden her phone went off in her pocket. And she looks at it, and it's not a call coming in. It's not an alarm. There was nothing she had said. But this page came up where she had taken down some notes of a word that a person named Kevin Hall had showed her the week before. And it was called Genshai, Genshai. And it means, it's an ancient Indian word, pre-Sanskrit, and it means to make no one small, not even yourself. Genshai. And as she was there on that rock, she felt that go through her.
Yeah.
And when she went into the courtroom, she would always write love on her hand to try to remember who she was and what she represented. And, stand up to these nasty attorneys and to Warren Jeffs. But from then on, she also started to write the word Genshai. So she had love and Genshai, and to not treat herself small anymore. Yeah. And miracle after miracle after miracle happens because of that. So now when I get in my shorts and I'm thinking, why me? And I'm in my sob story, I remember, show me. And I leave my, I try to connect to that greater consciousness field that to me is God. And then Genshai is, how do I treat myself and everyone else? Make no one small, not even myself. So that to me is one of the most powerful, life-changing stories I've ever had the opportunity to witness and to help write.
I think I have to breathe through that. That is so powerful. I love it. Like, it is literally sitting here with me as I'm listening to you share that. And I have the visual, of that actually just occurring, and can only imagine, what she was actually feeling and experiencing in that moment. It is so powerful. So powerful. And I think so many times I can actually, almost see that in the experiences that I have, especially when I'm in Africa, in Tanzania or in Malawi, and that story honestly being shared with so many of the people that I actually sit with would change everything for them. Thank you for sharing that. That is just extraordinary. Thank you.
Oh. Of course.
It's so easy for us to compare ourselves to the persona of what we actually see in somebody else. And I think just being able to hold on to something like that to change the narrative, of the story that we actually say about ourselves is just invaluable. Honestly, Bridget, thank you for actually bringing that, to this, discussion, to this chat, to this conversation. I hope that whoever actually hears this, just envelopes what you've just shared, for them, to actually show that there is so much more to them than what they've actually allowed the world to see. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, gosh, I've got so much that's actually running through my head at the moment, and images. So where do I go with that? I don't even know, but I think one thing that actually rings true in, if I actually think about just that story, we have got so many people that even with a title, even with an incredible amount of wealth, don't actually have that actual inner power and inner knowing of who they actually are. And I think the world is ready for that.
I think the world is hungry for that. I think it's hungry. Yeah.
And so, for all of the people who might actually hear this that have held onto a title or that actually attach their position, whether it is around their monetary possessions, their, the houses, the boats, whatever it is, to actually let go of that and find that actual inner knowing of who they are is what the world is actually yearning. And we don't talk about that. It's almost like people are actually knowing that there's something more, but they can't quite put their finger on it. Just being able to let go of what the world has actually told us, the systems that have been created to actually put us into that pigeonhole and say, this is where you belong. Letting go of that and actually finding the purity of who they genuinely are is so important. Bridget, if you were to actually be in a situation where you are standing in a room, you know, where we have got heads of state, people that actually hold incredible power of a system that's been created, what's the one message that you can actually share with them to give them, I guess, the opportunity to have the agency that they actually deserve to have for themselves? What would that message be?
If I may share one other story about that message, I would be so honored. So I was in Italy with Sheroes United, our nonprofit organization that's about assisting women to rise. And there was a Congolese leader who was running to be a head of state. And he honestly believed, which I still believe to be true, that it would be the women of the country of Congo that will save that country. And right now, it remains one of the most violent places in the world for women. So we had all these women refugees that we were teaching and, you know, interpreters, and there were diplomats and heads of state that were in that room as we got to do this training for women. And it was very fascinating because I was doing a training in terms of how they hold themselves and what their body language says and ways to recircuit their brain so that they can hold themselves with more confidence and to look anyone in the eye. And I will never forget, there was a woman in the room, Patricia Malanga, and she said, "So you're telling me that I can look any man in the eye?" And I said, "You have that right." And she said, "Not in my country." She said, "In our country, we are not allowed to look at our aunties and our uncles, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, anyone older than us. Our faces and our eyes must be turned towards the ground. It is not allowed." And I stood there for a moment because, number one, I was not going to make her wrong. That was her life in that country. That was the reigning belief. And also, you're very punished if you do. And all of a sudden, this little fiery nun who also came from Congo, and she stood up, and her name was Sister Theresa, not Mother Teresa, but Sister Theresa. And she stood up, and she probably came to about right here on me, but she was full of fire and power. And she said, "My sisters, this was not always so. When I was little and I was a baby and I was a toddler, I was adored by my aunties and my uncles and my grandmothers and my grandfathers and the leaders and the elders of our tribe. We were allowed." And she said, "It was not until Kabila the dictator came in and took power that suddenly we were not allowed." And the whole room just went silent because anyone younger than Sister Teresa thought that this had been going on for centuries. They thought this was the only way for them to lead and to be, and that there were these restrictions. And now all of a sudden, the whole world opened to them. And so I would love to share that if I were in a heads of state or in another situation just like that. Number one is that, you know, there are things that have been done, but it doesn't mean that they have to continue in that way. And that it takes one Sister Teresa of courage to be able to blow out that old belief system and to bring in something new. And number two is to allow yourself to embrace change when it is for the positive.
Yeah, I hear you, and the phrase, you know, what else is possible comes to mind. And that's something that I often actually say, don't ask yourself what if, because that one word will bring doubt. But if you ask yourself what else, you know, it actually opens up the possibility. And it is, for me, in my world, it is actually about the collective. You know, And it's also, I guess, I've heard, people actually share, I guess, the insight of who you actually were doesn't actually depict who you can become, right? So it's the same with systems too. We don't always have to accept what once was. So giving permission, and that works both ways. We have to actually be in an environment where that is actually an opportunity to be heard.
And if you are head of state, to give others an opportunity to be heard. Yeah.
And that takes courage too.
Do you know what my favorite thing to do is if I'm in a room of CEOs and heads of state?
What?
I do Roop Disha. I tell them they have to follow everything and that it is a serious leadership principle I'm about to teach them. So they all have to stand up and they have to follow me. And we say, thumbs up, wrists together, elbows in, boobs out. Roop Disha, Roop Disha. It doesn't matter who they are. They break into smiles and their inner child comes out and the whole playing field is leveled. It's amazing.
I love that. We're going to have to do that one day.
Yes, we will. I will enjoy doing that with you.
Oh, Bridget, I think that's actually a really good way to perhaps actually lead that lasting message to whoever is actually listening to this podcast.
That's perfect.
So for anybody who's actually listening, I always actually ask the guests, what's the one message that you would like people to actually take away from what we've just shared today?
Roop Disha. But a little more seriously, Genshai, to make no one small, not even yourself.
I love that. I'm going to take that away. Bridget, I'm going to say this was extraordinary. Not that I expected anything else, but it's always a privilege to actually sit in the space with you. Thank you so much for actually joining me and for sharing such insight and wisdom.
Thank you, Cathy. I love and appreciate you. Thank you for your patience with me, and thank you for your ongoing, endearing love and opportunities to do extraordinary things together. I'm so excited.
Me too.
This was Let's Pay Attention, Hacking Consciousness. Stay awake, lead with heart, be bold enough to listen deeply. I'm Cathy Dimarchos. Until next time, be the impact.